Betrayer is an odd game to describe or to review. Created in 2014 by Black Powder Games, it doesn't really sit comfortably in any one genre, while at the same time feels pretty beholden to the genres that it's a part of. It somehow defies explanation while simultaneously demanding it. It has aspects of the first person shooter, but nobody in their right mind would call it an FPS. It has some survival and some horror elements, but it's definitely not survival horror. It's a semi-open world with exploration and mystery solving game, but those aren't the core elements either. Likewise, there are stealth elements, heavy use of audio, and a dark dimension in the game, but those aren't really genres either. It's no Thief or Silent Hill, after all. So how would you describe it? A first-person semi-stealth, semi-survival, semi-horror exploration game? If you have to narrow something down that far, you're not really dealing with a genre anymore. You've abandoned top-level classification. It's like being an Amazon bestseller by narrowing your book's classification until it's the only one left. Like I said, Betrayer is an odd game to describe, at least in broad strokes. So let's drill down to the specifics. Fair warning, there won't be a spoiler section. This game is 7 years old. I'll be mixing spoilers in freely throughout the review, but they will likely be minor and minimal until I get to talking about the story itself. If you're the sort to care, you've been warned. So if you want the TLDR up front, I like this game and I think it's worth checking out. But now, let's get to the meat of things. And first up will be gameplay. As you can see from the footage playing and from what I've said, Betrayer is a first-person game. You have a small selection of weapons to use to protect yourself, a small number of trinkets to enhance your survivability, and a handful of special items that allow you to progress in the game. The core of the game here is probably solving the central mystery. Why are you here? Who is this woman in red? What happened to everybody? And what's up with these ghosts? Essentially, just what the hell is going on? At first, all you know is the general time period, 17th century, give or take, and that something has gone very, very wrong. The game slowly hands out hints in bits and pieces, epistolary style. You'll get direct testimony from ghosts, find ruined artifacts to help explain things, find notes, journal entries, and other papers, and you'll, well, find corpses that tell the story themselves, sometimes literally. So while the story isn't anything too earth-shaking or especially novel, it's still interesting enough with hints at something darker lurking that drove me forward to learn more, while at the same time making me want to hunt down all the graves and random bits of paper so I could get all the stories. Especially since many of the stories weren't connected to the main plot outside of being contemporaneous. But that's really just scratching the surface. There are also the other half of gameplay, which is more combat-focused. You essentially have 5 main weapon types: pistols, rifles, both of which are flintlock, longbows, short bows, and crossbows. You can have 3 equipped at any given point, and they start with limited ammunition and of poor quality, as would be expected. There was some thought and care put into these weapons. Bows are silent, but take a moment to draw to be fully effective. However, they do less damage. Firearms do considerably more damage, as well as having a bit of knockback, but they are very slow to reload and have much more limited ammunition. They're also quite loud, obviously. This provides a nice balance in accommodating the various playstyles and preferences, or allowing the player to mix and match. There's also 2 sub-weapons, tomahawks and bombs. Both have very limited inventory. Tomahawks, for instance, start at 1, but are extremely powerful. Bombs will deal a large amount of AoE damage to hit multiple enemies, but they'll also hurt you if you aren't careful. And they're expensive. Tomahawks, meanwhile, are mostly reusable and will pretty much instantly kill a single enemy. But again, you only have 1 to begin with, and being thrown, they have limited range. You also have a melee weapon that, like many first-person games, just kind of exists. You don't upgrade it, you don't equip it, you just press the melee button and it swings. It is, however, still quite useful, especially when low on ammunition and funds. To round things off, you have a water skin, which provides a substantial but not 100% heal. It can be freely and infinitely refilled at various outposts you make your temporary home, so you'll want to keep your fallback point in mind when exploring. I guess this segues nicely into talking about the enemies and the specifics about the combat, since it's such a key element to the game. There's a handful of different enemy types which stay at about the same level for the whole game. Some are just tougher than others. But in general, you have Spaniards, natives, skeletons, skull wraiths, deer skull wraith monster things, and a special one called the Thief. The Spaniards are the first enemy you'll face and the most common. They're dressed like conquistadors. What they're doing in colonial Virginia isn't exactly clear, but they're also not normal. They seem to be ghosts or monsters or zombies or something. Not too surprising considering how wrong everything is. Still, they're your basic cannon fodder, mostly, and are generally the ones you need to eliminate to unlock new forts and settlements, which are important for refilling your water skin, advancing the plot, and for the very limited fast travel system. You will face and kill a lot of these guys. Natives don't show up until later, but fill much the same niche. Skeletons, skull wraiths, and deer skull wraiths are all denizens of the Dark World, which we'll get into a little bit later. Finally, the Thief is a special enemy that spawns in certain areas. You need to sneak up on him and stealth kill him or he'll escape. It's a more challenging enemy than anything. And yes, there's an achievement tied to them. Stealth plays a major role in the combat, or rather, it can play a major role if you want it to. You can also blunder through like a wrecking ball, screaming "Scoot!" at the top of your lungs if you wish. But assuming you wish to play the game as intended, stealth will be important. While it has the obvious aspects of crouching and line of sight, it also includes audio, both for you and the computer. There's a wind mechanic in the game, so that when the wind is blowing, and thus the grass is rustling, it's safer to sneak because that helps cover up the noise you make. With care and patience, it's possible to get a lot of mileage out of these mechanics to stealth kill enemies by the score. I kind of like it. It lets you be sneaky when you want, but you can also charge right in if you're confident in your weapons and skill. Or you can have the best of both worlds by sneaking up and sniping a single foe with your rifle and then wading in for the rest. The world's your oyster. The fights seem pretty well balanced in terms of difficulty and frequency. I never found myself wondering if the designers had actually played their own game, and there were no difficulty walls that left me tearing out my hair. While at the same time, it wasn't so easy as to be inconsequential. I never wanted to walk into an unexpected fight, but I never felt that I was destined to die if I accidentally did. Which kind of makes sense. While the combat is important to the game, even central to the game, it's still not the core element. The game really is much more about the story and the mystery than killing endless waves of identical Spaniards. Again, it's not an FPS despite having shooting from a first-person perspective. So, how about that story? The game starts, as many do, with you having no idea what's going on. You wash up on shore a castaway from your sinking ship. You then make your way to various locations centered around important locations, such as Fort Henry, Fort St. George, and Fort Hope. This, of course, adds a bit of unreal, dreamlike quality to the game, since Fort Henry was in Virginia, Fort St. George was in Maine, and Fort Hope was in Connecticut. That said, you don't have to be intimately familiar with colonial forts to understand that something is very, very wrong, as if the ghosts and skeletons weren't a major clue. Throughout the game, the major plot you follow is an attempt to understand what is going on and figure out what's up with the woman in red. The first isn't fully explained, while the second is. However, there are plenty of, side quests and everything but name. There's about 15 investigations that you complete by finding clues and talking to shades, which usually involves shifting between the worlds. These are almost entirely very unhappy tales. For instance, you meet up with the shade of Gregory Ward, who is worried that Edmund Gotham hasn't returned from his patrol. Looking around, you discover where Edmund was killed. Speaking to Edmund's shade after finding an old map, you learn that the two had a disagreement about the map. A bit more digging, and Gregory's shade remembers what happens, and you get the full story. Gregory had Catholic sympathies, so he drew the map in question to aid the Spaniards, and he murdered Edmund to hide his treason. And that's one of the happier investigations. The ending of the game has somewhat ambiguous qualities. You discover what's going on in the Forbidden Wilds, you discover the full story of the woman in red, and try to solve what's going on, only to be, wait for it, betrayed in the end. Hey, how about that? Personally, though, I'm more curious about the broader picture of the story. Now, this is just my personal theory, but here's what I've got. In colonial Virginianicut, there was an uneasy mix of English, Spanish, and native. The area was mostly controlled by the English, while the Spaniards were attempting to infiltrate. As they didn't have any forts, I assumed they were skirmishers or advanced forces. They simply served to intensify the issues that already existed between the English and the natives. A young woman, Tabitha, had an illicit affair with a young native and became pregnant. This, unsurprisingly, enraged her father, who murdered her. This made things worse. In an attempt to calm Tabitha's spirit, her sister Allison found her corpse and burned it, hoping it would release her. But this only made Tabitha more enraged, which led to everything falling apart. So that's all outright stated. Now it's time to go off into conjecture land. The game makes mention of a sickness that affects the natives and the colonials that leaves their bodies blackened and foul-smelling. I believe the sickness is a curse from Tabitha's angry shade. The sickness also carried madness with it, beyond the madness that typically comes with contagion. Everyone was much more violent and rash. As everyone killed themselves and each other, she essentially pulled the region into her own private little hell. When you near the end game, you can release various shades by granting them forgiveness or consigning them to eternal torment. Once you release them, you can confront Tabitha, wear down her defenses, and then try to release her. But she can't leave because her sister, the only person to survive the death of everyone else, won't let her go. And that's what the ending is. The woman in red betraying your attempts to fully release Tabitha because she just can't let go of her sister and would rather wallow in purgatory than move on and deal with her grief. So, in reality, what I said isn't entirely accurate. While Tabitha is certainly responsible for the plague and the madness, I think the dreamlike world and unreality aren't her fault. They're Allison's fault, because the game takes place in literal purgatory. After all, you have the shades who are unwilling or unable to move on, trapped in a fog of confusion and uncertainty, awaiting judgment. It's never made truly clear who the protagonist is. My personal theory is that you play as Benedict Harper, a man who went out on an expedition and never returned, who is presumed to be dead. He's one of the few people who has no resolution, but who set many things in motion through his actions. It is, however, possible that you're just some random Englishman who wound up in this in-between world, but that seems unlikely to me. Harper has a connection to the region and would have been known by Allison, and thus it makes sense that when he died on his trek, his spirit was pulled back to Allison's purgatory. After all, you have memory loss, just like everyone else. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a neat little game with some big ideas and pretty solid execution. It's not an especially long game. I think it took me about 10 hours to 100% it. And it's not a AAA game by any means, but it's very solidly made. I can't find out too much about the company. Their Facebook page hasn't posted in over 3 years, and their website has expired. So I guess there's probably not going to be a sequel or another game in this setting. Would I recommend this game? Without question. I mean, for one thing, it's only $5. But more importantly, it's the story and the atmosphere. I really enjoyed playing this game and found myself firing it up to play even more when I only had a few minutes. So if any of this sounds interesting, I would encourage you to grab it on Steam. But be warned, it's a weird one.